There is a locomotive sitting in a Union Pacific yard in Omaha in the summer of 1964 that has not moved in months. 226 feet of it, longer than a Boeing 747. The longest locomotive anybody had ever built. And it is just sitting there on a dead track, going nowhere because the thing ate itself alive from the inside. It burned coal, not the way you think, not shoveled into a firebox by a sweating fireman. This monster ground the coal into powder finer than flour, blew it into a jet turbine spinning at thousands of RPM, and set it on fire. And that powder, that beautiful, clever solution, was sandblasting the turbine to death every single second it ran. This is the story of Union Pacific number 80, the coal turbine. The locomotive that drank so much fuel it needed its own tank car just to feed it, and still managed to destroy itself before it ever earned its keep. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We want to know who's out there. Start with why. The 1950s, Union Pacific is staring at the end of steam. The big boys and the challengers are on their way out. Diesel is coming, but the early diesels were weak, 2,000 horsepower a unit, and you needed a whole string of them to do what one big boy did. UP wanted something with the muscle of steam and the convenience of one engine, so they went somewhere nobody else dared. They strapped a jet engine to a railroad. The gas turbines came first. Big oil-burning brutes they called big blows because they screamed like a jet on a runway. You could hear one coming from miles away, a high banshee wail that rattled windows in towns along the line. California cities outlawed them, the noise was that bad, and those things had an appetite. The turbine burned roughly twice the fuel of a diesel making the same power, and it burned just as much sitting still at idle as it did pulling a mountain. The frame tank held 7,000 gallons, and that barely got them across Wyoming. So Union Pacific took old steam locomotive tenders, the big ones, and rebuilt them to haul 24,000 gallons of fuel. A whole separate car dragged behind the locomotive, existing for one reason: to keep the beast fed. And the fuel itself was a nightmare to handle. They ran on Bunker C, the bottom of the barrel, the sludge left over after the refinery took everything useful out of the crude. At room temperature, it had the consistency of cold molasses. It would not even flow through a pipe unless you heated it to 200 degrees first. So the tender had heaters built into it just to keep the fuel liquid enough to burn. That should have been the warning. But Union Pacific looked at those turbines and thought, what if we could feed it something even cheaper than oil? What if we could feed it coal? Union Pacific sat on top of the richest coal country in America. Wyoming coal, cheap and endless, right there under their own rails. If they could build a turbine that ran on coal, they would have the most economical locomotive on Earth. They would never be at the mercy of an oil company again. So in their own Omaha shops between 1959 and 1962, they built it, and calling it a locomotive is almost too kind. It was 3 machines stitched into one Frankenstein. Up front, the cab, a worn-out Alco PA1, one of the prettiest diesels ever made, number 607, stripped down and pressed into service as the brain. Its own 2,000 horsepower diesel left inside to add to the muscle. Behind that, the body. Built on the bones of a Great Northern Electric locomotive that Union Pacific bought for scrap, gutted, and filled with a 5,000 horsepower turbine pulled out of one of the older oil burners. And behind all of that, the tender. A coal car off a retired Challenger steam locomotive, the 3990 rebuilt into something nobody had seen before. Because this was not a coal tender that just held coal. Inside it, Union Pacific installed a crusher, a pulverizer. The coal went in as nuggets about an inch or two across, and the machinery in the tender ground it down into a fine dust, so fine it would flow through pipes and behave almost like a liquid. 61 tons of coal in that tender, enough for about 700 miles. The tank car was not an accessory, it was an organ. The locomotive could not eat without it. 7,000 horsepower all told, nearly 130,000 pounds of tractive effort, 226 feet long, stem to stern. When it fired up, the exhaust came screaming out of the stacks at over 780 degrees Fahrenheit. They tested it on Sherman Hill, the brutal grade west of Cheyenne, and on the run between North Platte and Cheyenne. It made its first real run hauling freight on October 17, 1962. And here is where the whole beautiful idea fell apart. The coal dust, the clever fine powder that flowed like a liquid. When you burn coal, even coal ground to flour, it leaves ash. Hard, gritty, abrasive ash. And that ash went straight through the turbine at the speed of a hurricane, slamming into the spinning blades thousands of times a second. Picture that for a second. A blade spinning at the heart of a jet engine, and a constant stream of microscopic rocks hammering into it, hour after hour. The blades were made of a high nickel alloy called nimonic, built to survive jet engine heat. It did not matter. The fly ash sandblasted them anyway. The same thing had already plagued the oil burners, where the ash in the bunker sea ate at the blades. With coal, it was not just bad, it was catastrophic. Every hour that turbine ran, it was grinding itself down. The blades eroded, the edges went dull and pitted, the soot built up where it should not. UP engineers put an ash separator in to catch the grit before it hit the turbine. It was not good enough. Too much got through. And the part that did get caught, they just dumped it straight out the exhaust into the open sky over Wyoming, a black smear trailing behind the train, because nobody in 1962 was thinking about that. The men who worked on it in Omaha said the only time it ran halfway decent was when they cheated and fed it oil instead of coal. The whole point of the machine was coal, and the only way to keep it alive was to not use coal. It flamed out constantly. The fuel transfer rates were almost impossible to control, so the turbine would just die mid-run, leaving 200-plus feet of dead locomotives sitting on the main line. It spent more time in the shop than it ever spent on the road. A railroader who was in the Omaha shops in the spring and summer of 1964 said the big coal turbine never moved from its storage track the whole time he was there, just sat, dead. In 1965, they renumbered it from 80 to 8080 to free up the number 80 for the new diesels. By then, it was already a corpse. It made its last run on May 12, 1964. In its entire life, it ran less than 10,000 miles. 10,000. A road diesel does that in a couple of months. This thing took 2 years to build, cost a fortune, swallowed coal by the ton, and died before it had gone the distance a normal locomotive covers between oil changes. They scrapped it. The turbine that ate itself cut up for metal. The Alco PA cab went back to regular service because a good diesel is a good diesel. But the dream of the coal-fired turbine, the most economical locomotive on Earth, ended on a dead track in Omaha with a machine that destroyed itself trying to live. And that is the cruel joke at the heart of it. Union Pacific built the longest locomotive in the world, gave it its own tank car full of pulverized coal, 7,000 horsepower, the muscle to drag a mountain. And the very fuel that was supposed to make it cheap was the thing that chewed it to pieces from the inside out. It needed its own tank car to feed it, and in the end, the thing inside that tank car is exactly what killed it. Sometimes the cleverest machine in the yard is just the most expensive way to learn a lesson everybody else already knew.